man in the shadows. He came in when the lights went out, when the coffee machines were silent, and the echo of hurried footsteps had faded into nothing. His name was Robert Lee Harris. Though few ever asked, he didn't wear a lab coat. He didn't carry a clipboard. But he knew every hallway of Langford Research Facility like the back of his wrinkled hand. To the security cameras, he was a ghost with a mop. To the scientists, just the old janitor who didn't talk much. But Robert watched, and he remembered. He saw what others didn't. The building itself was an aging beast. Langford had once been a crown jewel of nuclear research in the Midwest. Funded heavily during the Cold War, then quietly neglected as the decades passed. Still, deep in its concrete gut, experiments continued on fusion, isotopic stability, containment materials. Young minds buzzed through its fluorescent-lit corridors. Bright-eyed interns, weary PhD candidates, professors chasing grants. They were brilliant, yes, but they were human. And humans forget to check seals, override protocols, leave coffee cups too close to lab consoles. Robert didn't forget. He couldn't. He arrived every night at 10:15 p.m., sharp. Always the same. Navy blue coveralls, gray beanie in winter, soft leather gloves even in summer. He never used the elevator. Always took the stairs. No one asked why. They didn't know his legs still ached from a mining accident in '78. They didn't know he used to be a machinist, a draftsman, even had a short stint with General Electric in the early '80s before downsizing pushed him into night work. They didn't know he'd buried a son who died because of a faulty reactor valve in a different lab, in a different city, under a different silence. So now he watched, not because it was his job, but because silence had once cost him everything. At 11:03 p.m., he would reach the fusion wing. He never touched anything, but he'd lean just slightly to examine the pressure gauges, memorize the readings. He'd pause at the sodium coolant pumps, listen for irregularities beneath the hum. One night, a young physicist named Dana left a calibration sheet on top of a heat coil terminal. The next morning, it was gone, folded neatly and placed on her desk. No note, no name. Another night, a red warning light blinked for 13 seconds, then stopped. It was dismissed as a sensor glitch. Robert logged the time, walked into Lab 3C, and stood staring at the reactor's heat sink. He said nothing, just stared for 12 full minutes. Then he left. And the next day, someone else noticed corrosion on the coolant tray. They called it a lucky catch. He never said a word. The janitor closet on level B2 wasn't like the others. Inside was a shelf with cleaning supplies, sure, but tucked behind a false panel was something more. A small logbook, graph paper, handwritten diagrams. Robert had been quietly sketching flaws in Langford's infrastructure for over 9 years. He mapped air vent paths that allowed hazardous vapors to reach adjacent wings. He documented which reactors were slow to cool after emergency tests. He noted how the backup generators didn't kick in fast enough by 0.7 seconds during monthly simulations. He knew the whole facility better than anyone who worked there because they came for 5-year fellowships. But Robert had been there 22 years. Sometimes he'd hum while he mopped. Not songs, sequences, cadences, the rhythm of a pressure chamber stabilizing, the hiss of valves, the pulsing beep of monitors. The building had become his symphony. He knew when something was off, like a wrong note in a familiar melody, and when it was, he'd fix it, silently. He once replaced the sealant under a pressure dome at 3 a.m. He once taped a warning to a containment chamber handle. Check latch integrity. Nobody knew who did it. Nobody asked, because who would suspect the janitor? There was a camera in hallway C7. Old, grainy, black and white. One night, the footage showed Robert staring at the emergency control panel for a full minute, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and smiled, as if he had seen something no one else did, as if he had just prevented something. And he had. But no one would know, not yet. They say heroes wear capes, or medals, or at least titles. Robert wore rubber gloves and carried a mop bucket, but in the belly of that sleeping building, He was the final checkpoint, the last defense, the man no one remembered, but the one who never forgot. Night walks between labs. The night wasn't silent. It just didn't speak. The saw from the wires behind the ceiling, the murmur of water inside pipes, the rhythmic groan of aging ventilation. To Robert, Langford wasn't just a building. It was a symphony that restarted every night, and he was its lone listener. By 12:15 a.m., the second hour of his shift, the labs were rarely asleep. Some professors stayed late. Others forgot mugs, left terminals blinking, or left radiation sensors pulsing quietly in crimson. Robert, walking the main corridor, would always slow his steps here. Not too loud, not too soft. His gait was its own ritual. With time, every corridor had become a checkpoint. Every pause, a silent inspection. The building belonged to him after midnight, but he never treated it as his. One night, he passed a chemical analysis lab. A test tube had been left on the table, uncapped, unlabeled. The cooling unit's lid was half open. Robert entered, didn't remove his gloves, didn't touch the tube, but he gently closed the lid, picked up a marker, and on a blank sticker wrote a single word. Unattended. He placed it on the desk, then walked out. No one saw him enter, but in the morning, the lab was buzzing. That particular experiment was never left out again. Robert's favorite sector was Reactor 1 level. It was the part most people avoided. High-pressure testing labs. Steel silence. A place that even made scientists uneasy. But Robert was never afraid to walk there. He didn't just understand systems. He understood people. And long ago, he'd learned that machines aren't the real danger. Neglect is. One night, he stood in front of the control panel. A light on the lower right corner was flickering. It was supposed to stay a constant yellow. The flicker was too subtle for most eyes to even register. Robert saw it. He leaned closer, wiped a layer of dust from the panel with his gloved hand, pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote, 126 Reactor, 1 panel G/8, flickering light, possible voltage dip. The next day, the electrical team reported minor frequency fluctuation. But that flicker would later prove to be the first warning of a chain reaction. 6 weeks later, that very system would nearly fail. Robert didn't know the future, but instinct had always been his shield, and his instincts had been forged through pain. During night shifts, Robert had no one to talk to, but sometimes he whispered to himself. They're brilliant, but too fast. Doors lock, but awareness opens. Those murmurs disappeared into the air ducts. No one heard, but the building listened. Every step he took left a vibration. Every touch, a reminder. He wasn't just in the building, he was part of it. He would often pause at the convex mirrors at corridor ends. There, he saw his own reflection. Stooped shoulders, creased forehead, narrowed eyes. Sometimes he whispered to the mirror, "They won't remember me." And then he would turn and keep walking. It wasn't a complaint. He never did it to be remembered. He did it because it was right. Some nights, he'd find forgotten notebooks on desks. He'd read the first page or two. Code, equations, formulas. Most he couldn't follow, but some reminded him of his engineering days. Once, in a doctoral student's notes, he read, "Cooling cycle drift again. Sense a glitch." That night, Robert spent over an hour by the coolant pump. He heard a difference, just 1 decibel off. Barely noticeable, but it was real. That tiny difference would later stop a system from melting down. And no one knew. A quiet fear had begun to drift through Langford. Budget cuts, staff changes, aging infrastructure. The risk was growing. But one man kept walking the halls as always. Every step a silent battle. Every night, a war won that no one would ever hear about. He was just a janitor, but he was so much more. Small in presence, massive in impact, a shadow. But without shadows, light means nothing. And in the stillest hour of night, in the narrow breath between 2 reactor wings, he kept walking, and no one knew coffee stains, and reactor warnings. It was never the loud alarms that save lives. It was a tiny red light blinking under a desk, the barely audible hum changing pitch. The coffee stain in the wrong place at the wrong time. Robert had learned that disasters didn't begin with explosions. They began with silence. Monday night, 1:12 a.m. The Langford facility was half asleep. A storm rumbled faintly outside, thunder muffled by concrete walls and reactor shielding. Robert walked through the west corridor holding a worn rag in one hand, a flashlight in the other, not for light, but to see things differently. He entered Lab 2A. No one had been there in hours, but the coffee smell still lingered, burnt, stale, stubborn, on the center table. A coffee mug tipped over, its contents spilling toward the edge of a lab console. Not a crisis, not even a concern, just a careless detail. But Robert's eyes narrowed. The spill was inching toward a bundle of sensor wires. Thin, color-coded, frayed at the ends. He reached into his coveralls, pulled out a folded paper towel, and gently wiped the liquid before it reached the wires. Then, out of habit, he looked up at the small data screen on the wall. A digital temperature reading. It blinked once, then again, then returned to normal. Robert stood motionless. He walked to the panel, slowly, touched nothing, just stared at the blinking cursor next to the temperature log. It was off by 0.3 degrees Celsius from the previous record. To most, a rounding error. To Robert, a knock at the door failure. He turned and left, but not before he slid a note under the keyboard. Temp drift. Please verify. No signature. In the next lab, the air was colder, not because of the temperature, but because of what was being tested. Graphite shielding modules, a critical component in nuclear containment. Robert had seen them break before, decades ago. The fracture lines looked like veins, like cracks in porcelain. He remembered what it cost. 3 injured, 1 gone. He glanced at the modules on the table, stacked neatly, all labeled, except one. A single slab with no marking, no ID, out of place. He bent down, ran a gloved hand gently along the edge. It felt warmer than the others. That shouldn't happen. Robert didn't panic. He didn't even blink. He quietly stood up, took a photo with a disposable camera he kept in his cart, and marked the slab with a tiny piece of tape. Nothing more. The next morning, a materials engineer named Dr. Calder would find that slab and send it for testing. The results would show a microfracture invisible to the naked eye, caused by improper storage temperature. The slab had been scheduled for a structural test inside reactor 3 the following week. Had it gone in, things would have changed forever, and no one would have known why, except the janitor. Robert didn't leave evidence. He didn't claim credit. He didn't even check whether others noticed. He just kept walking. At 2:04 a.m., the main corridor's motion sensor lights flickered on. Robert passed beneath them like a shadow, silent and deliberate. His next stop, the north ventilation chamber. He always checked it last. It wasn't part of his route, but it was where the pressure differentials were most fragile, and where years ago his son had once worked. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't nostalgia. It was responsibility. Inside the vent control room, the lights buzzed faintly. Panels blinked. Data streamed across monitors. And on the corner desk, another coffee mug, half full, next to a clipboard. Robert walked past it, stopped, backed up. He read the top sheet of the clipboard. Ventilation cycle report, 4th loop lag. He blinked. 4th loop was the fallback cycle, the one that engaged if the first 3 failed. It should never have lag. He opened the side cabinet where emergency schematics were stored, scrolled through the files until he found the airflow diagram, ran his finger across the grid, found the 4th loop circuit, paused. There it was. A duct reroute schedule for next month was already half-activated in the system. Someone had triggered it early, likely to prep for an inspection, but the reroute created a vacuum imbalance that would delay pressure equalization in the event of a coolant leak. Robert exhaled, long and slow. He took out his pen, circled the section, taped the schematic to the front of the desk. and underlined a phrase, "Immediate review required." When the engineers arrived that morning, they'd call it a miracle catch, but none of them would know who caught it. The camera in the vent room had been broken for weeks, and the night log simply read, "No incidents." Coffee stains, sensor flickers, unlabeled graphite, loop delay. Nothing screamed emergency. No alarms rang. No protocols were breached. But Robert knew disasters don't explode into being. They gather quietly, like dust in corners no one checks. And sometimes the janitor does. The error nobody noticed. Some errors don't scream. They don't crash systems or throw sparks. They don't come with sirens or flames. They just exist, buried in code, hidden in routines, waiting. Robert had learned long ago that the most dangerous mistakes weren't loud. They were invisible because they were ignored, and this time, he could feel one breathing behind the walls. Thursday night, 12:37 a.m. The wind outside Langford rattled the pipes like bones shaking in a forgotten crypt. Inside, the facility slept under artificial light. But Robert didn't sleep, and neither did his instincts. He walked with practiced calm, each step as steady as the one before. But something tonight felt tilted, off balance, like the building was whispering. When he entered Lab 5D, the hum of electronics greeted him, faint, almost kind. But there, on the far wall, a soft green LED glowed. That light was never supposed to be on at night, especially not there, especially not for that system. He moved closer. The screen read, "Coolant simulation test, passive mode active." His lips pressed into a thin line. His breath slowed. Passive systems didn't turn themselves on, not unless something or someone had interfered. He didn't panic. He never did. But something inside his chest shifted, a crack in the quiet. He opened his notebook. Pages of scribbles, pressure readings, cycle times. But this didn't belong on any of them. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't have a place in logic. It wasn't just wrong. It was impossible. He didn't write. He just stood there, watching a green light that didn't blink, a light that pretended everything was fine. He scanned the room. Everything appeared normal. Cables coiled neatly. Consoles in sleep mode. No alarms. No warnings. And that terrified him. Order can be a liar, especially when it's too perfect. Especially when the danger is already inside. On the desk near the control console, a schematic lay open. The coolant system for 5D, every pipe, valve, and circuit drawn in detail. But it was the handwritten note in the corner that chilled him. Still under test. Manual override engaged. His heart skipped. A passive system on manual override meant no emergency response. No auto-cooling. No safety trigger. In a real thermal event, it would just sit there, waiting to melt. He picked up the schematic slowly, held it in both hands. And in that moment, he remembered the smell of burning graphite. The thick smoke of reactor 2 years ago, the look on the safety inspector's face, the phone call he never got to make to his son. Robert closed his eyes, not in pain, in remembrance, in warning. He taped the schematic to the top of the console, wrote across it in red pen. Check. Again. Immediately. No initials, no explanation, just a command. And then he walked out. But his footsteps didn't feel the same. The rest of the night blurred. Corridors, stairs, the softest of vents. None of it grounded him. His thoughts kept circling that green light. The system that shouldn't have been running. The temperature that had started to rise. Slowly, silently. At 2:30 a.m., he entered the main control room. 2 technicians on shift. One asleep in his chair. The other checking systems. But not 5D. Robert didn't speak. He never did. He walked up to the monitor, glanced for 2 seconds. It was still on, still green, still wrong. And now, 1.4 degrees Celsius hotter than 4 hours ago. Still, no one noticed. Still, no one asked, He stepped back into the hallway. Leaning against the cool cement wall, he finally exhaled. His hands trembled, not because of fear, but because of weight, the weight of silence. He had spent his life fixing things quietly, patching holes no one else saw, mending fractures with tape and instinct. But tonight, he felt outnumbered, outpaced. He was patching a sinking ship with sewing thread. For the first time in years, he wanted to yell, shake someone, make them look, but he knew they wouldn't hear him, because to them, he was just a janitor. And so, he walked, with a heavy cart and heavier thoughts. But something in him had shifted. He was no longer just maintaining the building. He was bearing witness to its decay, and worse, to the indifference that let it rot. The floors gleamed under his mop, but the guilt didn't wash away, because tonight, he wasn't cleaning up after people. He was trying to clean up after silence. There was no meltdown that night, no fire, no panic, but something began, not in steel, not in software, in Robert, a fracture, small, quiet, just like the error no one had noticed. The moment the system stopped, buildings don't break easily, but people do, and sometimes, before a system collapses, a man's inner defenses collapse first. That night, Langford was still standing, but Robert was not. Friday night, 1:09 a.m., Reactor 3 level, almost completely dark. Robert walked his usual route, but this wasn't just a janitor's path anymore. It was the path of an instinct being pulled toward alarm. His face was as calm as always, but inside, a silent siren rang with every door he passed. The passive system in Lab 5D still read as active. It hadn't changed in 3 nights. But tonight, another screen flickered. The heat balance panel of Reactor 3. A small anomaly. A temperature rise of 0.9 degrees Celsius. Negligible, according to the system, but not to Robert, because this wasn't just a number. It was part of a pattern, and that pattern was drawing its final breath. He bent over the panel, didn't stare at the screens. He listened to the building, to its pulse, to the low-frequency hum that felt more like memory than sound. Sometimes silent screams. Alongside the temperature shift, another panel showed a voltage dip, 0.5 volts, logged as transient. But Robert had stopped believing in that word. Transient was often just delayed collapse. He turned, and in the far corner of the lab, he saw them, yellow safety tapes. For the first time since his son's death, those tapes didn't remind him of caution. They reminded him of inaction, because caution tape doesn't warn the living. It cordons off what's already gone. At 1:47 a.m., the backup power generator for Reactor 3 dipped for 6 seconds. Just 6. The system rebooted automatically. No alerts. Technicians marked it normal fluctuation. Robert read the log, then closed his eyes, and slowly shook his head, because 6 seconds can be a lifetime. What if next time it doesn't restart? What if the restart never comes? He walked to a place no one ever checked, the old maintenance archive, where the dust smelled like rust, and the air carried memories more than oxygen. In the far end, he approached a forgotten emergency transformer panel, one he had modified himself years ago. It was his secret failsafe, his silent alarm. He crouched, removed his gloves, checked the wiring. Everything was still in place, except one cable, slightly loose, and that looseness was enough to trigger a desynchronization between the simulation in 5D and the response in Reactor 3. The system didn't see it, but Robert did, and this time, he wouldn't just observe. This time, he would act. He reached out, adjusted the cable gently, and in that moment, the building trembled, not violently, not dramatically, but just enough for a man who knew the difference between coincidence and consequence. Something stopped right then, but it wasn't the system. It was Robert, after decades of holding back. of absorbing every silent failure into his own bones. Something inside him cracked, but he didn't cry. This wasn't collapse. It was a shattering of silence. He stepped back into the corridor, empty. Everyone still trusted the system, but the system had failed for 6 seconds, and the only person who knew was the man no one saw. He returned to his storage closet, took out a clean sheet of paper, and wrote a single sentence. The system may be running, but it no longer inspires trust. No signature. He folded the paper, left it on the technician's desk. There was no disaster that night. Again, but it wasn't a victory, because something else had stopped, Robert's faith. And now, he finally understood, a system working isn't the same as a system worth trusting. The weight of witnessing. To witness is not the same as to watch. Watching is passive. Witnessing leaves a mark. It doesn't fade into memory. It settles into your bones. And every burden has a breaking point. Robert was no longer part of the system. He had become its shadow. Not in it, not above it, but silently wrapped around its every fault line. 5DS persistent anomaly. Reactor 3's voltage stutter. 6 seconds of darkness. A loose cable. A technician who didn't look. A system that didn't speak. Each event on its own, small. Together, they whispered, "Something is wrong." Saturday night, 12:51 a.m. Robert stood in Langford's West Wing, not holding a mop, not pushing a cart, hands in pockets, eyes lifted, not at the ceiling, but beyond it, into the wires, the bones of the building. He wasn't looking at the surface anymore. He was trying to see what lived underneath. He walked through a door, then another, down a corridor lined with office plaques. Dr. A. Jennings, Engineer L. Kwan, Observation Room, Security, Equipment Supervisor, Archives. Not a single plaque bore his name. They never had, but no one had walked this hallway more than he had. No one had listened harder. No one had said less. At a small observation window, he stopped. The sky beyond was clouded, but it was a reflection in the glass that held him. Creased skin, tired eyes, a bent frame, faded blue. But tonight, for the first time, there was rage in his reflection. Not loud, not explosive, but the kind that simmers in silence for 20 years. Who was it for? The system? The careless? The blind? Or maybe himself? Because he had known all this time, and he hadn't spoken, because no one would have listened. At 1:37 a.m., he entered the main control room. The technician on duty was pouring tea. They made brief eye contact. Robert nodded. The technician didn't nod back, because to him, Robert was just a janitor. But Robert noticed something. The alert icon on the 5D monitor was gone. The simulation had been switched back to automatic. Someone had made the correction, but the system report said nothing. No comment, no log, no one took responsibility. That was the worst sign of all. It meant everyone was quiet now. Robert walked out, down the stairwell, past the old archives, and into a silence he had built over decades. He reached the records room. Musty, dark, forgotten. But in a way, it wasn't a room. It was a mirror, because Langford didn't hold the real archive. Robert did. Every silent alarm. Every glitch that wasn't. Every time someone almost died and didn't know it. All of it lived in his memory. And now, it wanted out. He sat at a desk. Not his. He never had one. He pulled out his notebook. Pages and pages of pressure logs, voltage anomalies, cooling reports. But tonight, for the first time, he didn't write numbers. He wrote a sentence. I've come here quietly every night, and I've seen things. And the cost of seeing is that you can never close your eyes again. He dropped the pen, leaned back, and something inside him shifted. Not like breaking, more like molting, letting go of a silence he could no longer carry. That night, no systems failed, no lights blinked, no emergency, but the silence itself had become the emergency. Robert still said nothing. But now, his silence was no longer submission. It was becoming something else, something heavier, more dangerous, like a storm, coiled beneath decades of control, waiting, not for permission, for a reason. The night silence broke. Silence doesn't last forever. Apply enough weight, hold it in long enough, and it bursts, like a reactor, like a heart, like a man. It was the night between Saturday and Sunday. Langford stood at its darkest. Time, 2:44 a.m. A sudden current imbalance was detected in Reactor 3, just a few seconds of deviation. But this time, the system didn't recover. All control panels froze. Monitors blacked out. The alarms delayed by a full second. And in that moment, for the first time, the building's heart truly stopped. Robert was in the east wing of the third floor. Darkness had settled in. The air was heavy. But more than that, he felt it. The quiet signal he had waited for all these years. He didn't run. He didn't rush. But his walk changed. This wasn't a janitor's stride anymore. This was a response. By the time he reached the control room, chaos had begun. Backup power isn't kicking in. Log files are locked. No data stream. Robert said nothing, but his eyes locked on the screens, on the corners, where he saw it, that micro delay, the same signature he'd tracked silently for years, the same thing everyone had ignored. Now it had silenced the entire system. One technician shouted, "We need to open a manual override." Another panicked, "We don't even know the circuit layout anymore. When was the last schematic updated?" Robert didn't respond. He simply turned, walked down to the archive level, to a dusty cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a hand-drawn emergency bypass plan, one he had crafted years ago. Top left corner read, "Use only in last resort." Tonight was that resort. He returned upstairs, laid the plan gently on the technician's desk, didn't say a word, just pointed. His eyes said the rest. "You didn't see me, but I've always been here." Silence was no longer a shield. It had become the enemy. They rushed to implement it. Old circuits, manual valves, backup panels no one had touched in decades. One voice asked, "Who drew this?" Robert said nothing, because the answer wasn't in ink. It was in the wires. It was in the lives not lost. 3 minutes later, the system restarted, section by section. Power came back. Cooling engaged. Terminals responded. And Langford survived. But that night, it wasn't just the system that had been saved. Robert was heard for the first time. Later that morning, the supervisor's incident log read, "System-saving plan originated outside official records. Unknown author. No archival reference. But it saved lives." As Robert ended his shift, he walked to the far end of the hallway. Leaning against the wall, he took a long breath, and for the first time, he smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not relief, just a quiet exhale of a man who finally released something he had held for far too long, because now he knew. Sometimes staying silent is its own form of betrayal. That night, silence lost, and a man who had lived in its shadow stepped forward, not to be seen, but to be felt, not to fix the system, but to stop the silence. A forgotten name, a life remembered. Some lives aren't remembered, but they're still felt. The absence of a name is sometimes filled by the quiet presence of shadow, and a man who walked in silence can be the one holding an entire system together. Langford woke up the next morning like any other day. Panels were working. Cooling systems were stable. Security logs were clean. But something was different. No one could tell what, but the building's sound had changed. There was an echo in the walls, like someone who had whispered for years, had finally shouted, but no one knew who it was. When the night technician found the slip of paper, it had only a few words. The system may be functioning, but if no one notices, it's already failed. No signature. But this time, people started looking. A few engineers asked for copies of the plan. Some tried to match the handwriting to retired staff, but the archive had no such name, no record of Robert Harris. Because Robert had never been counted as part of the system, he was always background. And now, his name was gone, but his trace was everywhere. That morning, as his shift ended, Robert walked the main corridor one last time. Slow, silent, but this time his head was high. No one greeted him, but he wasn't waiting for it, because the real recognition isn't in words, it's an awareness. Now, every time someone walked those halls, they wondered, who else is watching? Robert didn't submit a resignation, didn't leave a farewell note, didn't request a meeting, because a man who was never officially present didn't need to say goodbye. He just left, but he left something behind, the invisible fingerprints of someone who never needed credit to protect you. Months later, Langford underwent full system upgrades. Backup panels were replaced, security protocols modernized, but one thing remained. Technology advanced, but still, no one looked like Robert did. A year after the night, a small bulletin board appeared in the Langford cafeteria. Its title, The Anonymous Intervention. Below it, this message: a system runs not only on its parts, but on the eyes that watch them. Sometimes those eyes belong to a scientist, sometimes a technician, and sometimes just a man carrying a mop. He didn't leave his name, but he saved us all. When the story ends, no one may remember Robert Harris. But if one system breathes a little longer, if one child keeps their father, if one alarm rings a second sooner, know this: it is the unheard scream of a man who refused to stop listening. Silent heroes don't write history. They stop it from collapsing. And sometimes you save lives, knowing they'll never know your name, and still you save them. Speech balloon, he was just a janitor, but that night, he saved everything.